Hello, this is Kylie. Welcome back to Fem and Flow. I hope you're having a great day. Today we are continuing the Hijacked Blueprint series. In the last 5 episodes, we've traced the arc of inversion, how sacred design was seeded on Earth, how Gnosis was burned and suppressed, and how the 12 tribes were fractured into distorted archetypes. We also talked about the truth behind our DNA and what it means to restore our divine blueprint. Today, we're going to bring the story forward into one of the most important planetary nodes of modern history, America. Because whether you live here or not, America is more than a country. It was seeded as an experiment, a convergence point, and for many, a new Atlantis. Now, let's start off with some background before we weave in this concept. In a previous episode, we also talked about what I call the Divine Integration Program. This was the original spiral program seated on Earth, a design where we entered this reality with our 12-strand DNA partially dormant so that we could experience a veil of amnesia. The core question of this program was, if we disconnect from our divine blueprint, can we find our way back? Or in other words, if we disconnect from source, can we find our way back? The way back was not meant to be linear. It was structured as a spiral path of initiation, where each soul would remember and re-embody its wholeness by balancing 12 different archetypes within themselves. These archetypes weren't roles to play, but tones of consciousness, divine functions of being. And through what many mystics call initiation, the spiral path would lead us back into coherence, one archetype at a time. Originally, this program was seated in what I call white hole coherence, a state of pure alignment with Source. In that state, the 12-step initiation spiral still existed, but it unfolded in beauty and harmony. The DNA was not yet fully online, so there was a natural veil of amnesia, but it was soft like a translucent mist, not the heavy fog we know in black hole physics. In white hole coherence, forgetting was simply the prelude to remembering. And each step of the spiral initiation was infused with joy, communion, and divine design. Over time, however, the frequency lowered. Polarity shifted from integration into conflict. And the same spiral that once initiated souls through graceful stages of awakening became inverted. When the program collapsed into black hole physics, that gentle veil of amnesia hardened into cycles of distortion, siphoning, and repetition without resolution. Before that collapse, there were attempts to stabilize and reverse the spiral. One of the most significant was the seeding of Atlantis. Atlantis wasn't just a myth or a lost civilization. It was designed as a planetary node to help humanity realign with the divine blueprint. The Atlantean experiment brought advanced spiritual technology, crystalline architecture, and priesthood lineages trained in holding gnosis. The goal was to accelerate remembrance and restore coherence. But Atlantis carried both light and shadow. While parts of it were aligned with Source, other aspects became compromised by hierarchy, elitism, and misuse of power. Instead of stabilizing the spiral, Atlantis itself fractured. And when it fell, it symbolized that the divine integration program had in fact collapsed fully into black hole physics. Fast forward through linear history, and we find that America was seeded in a very similar way. Just as Atlantis was meant to act as a node to restore coherence, America was envisioned as another reset point. But there's an important distinction. Atlantis was seated in much higher frequency bands. Its architecture rested closer to white hole coherence, which meant its spiral initiations were clearer, cleaner, and more resonant with divine design. America, by contrast, was planted within lower density fields. It was framed as the New World, a land of possibility, freedom, and human flourishing, but it had to contend with heavier layers of inversion already in place. Esoteric orders, mystics, and philosophers carried fragments of the original vision across the ocean, many explicitly referring to America as the New Atlantis. So when we look at America today, we're not just looking at a nation, we're looking at a continuation of the same pattern, but seated under different conditions. Atlantis carried the promise of coherence through higher frequencies, while America attempted to restart the spiral within denser bands. And as we'll see later, the suppression of the feminine meant that vision could not fully take root, leaving distortion in its place. Still, both were part of the same overarching attempt to reset the spiral after collapse and to see if humanity could realign with Source once again. So, at this point, it's important to ask, why America? Why at this moment in history? To answer that, we have to look at what was happening in the rest of the world. By the time the so called New World was being discovered, much of the Old World had become deeply entangled in inversion. Europe was dominated by monarchy and the Roman Church, both of which had inverted sacred truth into hierarchy and control. The burning of Gnosis, the persecution of mystics, and the suppression of indigenous European traditions like the Druids and pagans had left spiritual memory fragmented. The Middle East, once a hub of Hebrew mysticism and early Christic gnosis, had become the battleground of empire after empire. The Crusades, Islamic conquest, and Roman expansion turned holy sites into centers of conflict instead of coherence. Africa and Asia carried immense wisdom traditions, but both had already been touched by cycles of conquest, colonial ambitions, and extraction economies. Their knowledge was often hidden, suppressed, or commercialized by outsiders. In other words, the old world grid was heavy with empire. Hierarchies were calcified, institutions held control, and the spiral couldn't easily reemerge inside those same systems. This is what created the call for a new node, a fresh convergence point outside the entrenched structures of Europe and Rome, a land that hadn't been fully absorbed into empire yet, a blank slate where fragments of the divine blueprint could be seeded again. So, who made that call? It wasn't one group, but several streams converging. The first one was mystic philosophers like Francis Bacon envisioned the new Atlantis as a society where science and spirit could realign. Esoteric brotherhoods, the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and remnants of Templar and Essene lineages carried fragments of the original blueprint encoded in geometry, architecture, and ritual. Some were sincere in wanting to preserve gnosis, others already compromised by hierarchy. And then the third was higher intelligences, what many of us would call guides, councils, or oversoul directives, were also seeding this move in the field. The collective spiral itself was calling for a reset point, and America became the answer. So, America was not just a geopolitical accident, it was a deliberate convergence. From one angle, explorers, colonists, and philosophers saw opportunity. From another, there was a deeper orchestration, a new grid point chosen because the old ones had been overrun by inversion. That's why America carried so much potential, and that's also why it drew so much distortion so quickly. Now let's talk about the role of esoteric brotherhoods and Francis Bacon. To understand why America was envisioned as a new Atlantis, we need to look at the esoteric orders and thinkers who carried fragments of the original blueprint forward through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. One of the most important figures here is Francis Bacon. Bacon was not only a statesman and philosopher, but also connected to Rosicrucian and early Masonic circles. His unfinished book, The New Atlantis, painted a vision of a society guided by wisdom, science, and spirit, a society where knowledge was preserved and used for human flourishing, not exploitation. For many in these brotherhoods, Bacon's vision wasn't just literature, it was a roadmap. They believed the old world had become too entangled in church dogma and monarchy to allow this vision to take root. A new land was needed where sacred knowledge could be reseeded. America became that land in their imagination. Now, who were these esoteric brotherhoods? And before we dive into their names, it's important to remember something we've talked about in earlier episodes. Many groups began with light. They started as carriers of gnosis, fragments of the divine blueprint passed forward during times of suppression. But as we've seen again and again, inversion doesn't usually create something new. The dark doesn't originate, it imitates. It takes what is sacred and subtly inverts it, stripping out the spirit, flipping polarity, and turning what was once coherent into a tool for control. And this is exactly what happened with groups like the Freemasons. In their origin, Masonry wasn't about secrecy and power. It was about geometry, proportion, and alignment with source. Literally, the craft of building, which symbolized building both temples and human character in coherence. Over time, though, layers of hierarchy, elitism, and political entanglement distorted those roots. So when many people today hear Freemasons, they only think conspiracy or control. But the truth is more complex. The roots were light. The blueprint was real. What we see now is often the inverted version that hijacked that original stream. And the same pattern applies across history. Templars, priests, prophets, mystics. They carried truth, and then their lineages were split, inverted, or co opted. That doesn't erase the sacred origin. It just means we have to discern between the original tone and the distorted performance. So, that being said, here are the esoteric brotherhoods. The Rosicrucians emerged in the early 1600s through a series of manifestos that blended Christian mysticism, alchemy, and Hermetic wisdom. They saw themselves as carriers of hidden truth who worked quietly to guide cultural renewal. The Freemasons, developing around the same time, preserved sacred geometry, architectural symbolism, and initiatory ritual. Many founding fathers, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, were Freemasons. In its highest form, Freemasonry still carried fragments of gnosis about polarity, proportion, and the human body as a temple. Remnants of the Templars and Essenes also filtered into these movements. After the destruction of the Knights Templar in the 1300s, some strands went underground, merging with Masonic and Rosicrucian currents. And the Essenes, the mystical Jewish sect that carried Christic gnosis before and during Yeshua's time, were remembered as spiritual ancestors to many of these groups. Together, these brotherhoods believed they were preserving a sacred trust, fragments of the divine blueprint hidden in symbols, rituals, and architecture until the world was ready to receive them again. But here's the duality. Some members truly sought to restore coherence. Others were already serving hierarchy, power, and empire. That's why Masonic symbols can be read both ways. as genuine carriers of sacred geometry and as tools of control when inverted. Francis Bacon himself is sometimes considered the hidden architect behind much of the early colonial vision. What is clear is that his new Atlantis became a guiding myth. America as a new beginning, a chance to restart the spiral. This is why, when we look at America's founding, we see double coding everywhere. On one side, liberty, equality, and the pursuit of truth. On the other, slavery, conquest, and economic exploitation. Both were seeded from the beginning. And we also need to be clear about where inversion around the feminine began showing up in these orders themselves. Most of the esoteric brotherhoods, whether Rosicrucians, Freemasons, or even earlier Templar lines, were male only institutions. Women were almost always excluded, or at best allowed through auxiliary adoptive branches that didn't carry the same authority. It wasn't accidental. It reflected the larger inversion we've traced since the burning of Gnosis, the silencing of the feminine as tone. Remember, in the true spiral, the feminine carries the vibrational field, and the masculine gives it form. To live in coherence with Source, no matter our gender, our feminine energy must lead. This isn't just about women, it's about the inner feminine current that every human carries. But it is also about women, whose bodies and voices are designed to anchor that field into matter. By the time these orders took shape, both aspects had been suppressed. The inner feminine was subordinated to logic and hierarchy, and the living presence of women as spiral keepers was reduced to symbol, myth, or erasure. Mary Magdalene was written out of the Christ story. The womb was shamed. Priestesses were eliminated from temple roles. So while the brotherhoods did preserve geometry, ritual, and fragments of sacred knowledge, they did so in a half field. Without the embodied feminine, the current was incomplete, which made it easier to distort. That imbalance is part of why Masonry, for example, could evolve into both a genuine initiatory path and a political network of elitism. The feminine tone was missing, so polarity couldn't integrate. This is one of the earliest cracks where the feminine inversion embedded itself into the very structures meant to safeguard the blueprint. The knowledge wasn't false, but it was fractured. And when the feminine isn't honored in form, even sacred symbols can be co-opted into control. And we can see the same pattern carry straight into the founding of America itself. Just like the esoteric brotherhoods that influenced its vision, the new nation was built with half the field missing. Women were barred from voting, holding office, or even owning property in many cases. The ideals of liberty and equality were written into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but all men are created equal was taken literally. Women, along with enslaved people and indigenous nations, were written out of the promise from the very beginning. Even the spaces where esoteric knowledge was preserved, Masonic lodges, councils, secret societies, remained closed to women. The feminine showed up only as a symbol: Columbia, Liberty, Lady Justice. She was invoked as an image but denied a role in the actual architecture of power. This is the same feminine inversion we've traced since the collapse of the Divine Integration Program. The body as temple became the body as commodity. The womb as source of wisdom became the womb as shame. And in America, the pattern repeated. The feminine was honored in statues and allegories, but excluded from governance and initiation. That exclusion mattered. Because a blueprint seated without the feminine present is already fractured. It might carry the appearance of freedom and coherence, but without polarity integration, the system bends back toward hierarchy. And that's exactly what we saw. A republic envisioned as a new Atlantis, but already seated with distortion because half the spiral wasn't allowed to participate. In Atlantis, seated at higher frequencies, the spiral initiation still carried clarity before collapse, but America began in denser bands, carrying inversion in its soil from the start. The suppression of the feminine ensured that what was meant to be a reset point was already compromised. Its spiral bent under the weight of lower frequency seeding. Now let's talk about indigenous codes and the original spiral in America. When we talk about America as a new Atlantis, we also have to acknowledge something that may be obvious when it comes to the story. The land wasn't empty. It was already alive with sacred codes, carried and stewarded by indigenous nations for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Across the continents, indigenous peoples held sophisticated spiritual systems, governance models, and ceremonies that were directly aligned with the spiral. These weren't primitive societies. They were deeply coherent cultures rooted in polarity balance, natural law, and reverence for the land as a living being. The Iroquois Confederacy developed the Great Law of Peace, a model of governance based on unity, council decision making, and stewardship of future generations. This directly influenced part of the U.S. Constitution, though the feminine balance present in that society, where clan mothers had significant political authority, was stripped out. The Mississippian cultures built vast earthwork mounds aligned to solstices, star systems, and river flows. The same kind of sacred geometry we see in pyramids and stone circles around the world. These weren't random structures. They were grid points designed to harmonize human community with the cycles of heaven and earth. Southwestern nations like the Hopi and Pueblo peoples carried oral prophecies of cycles of collapse and renewal, spirals of time, and humanity's role in remembering how to live in balance. Their kiva structures, circular underground chambers, reflected the spiral of emergence, the womb of Earth itself. The Plains nations encoded spiral cosmology into ceremony. The sun dance, for example, wasn't just a ritual suffering. It was about renewal, sacrifice for the collective, and maintaining balance between people, animals, and land. In other words, America was never a blank slate. It was already a living node of the divine integration program. The blueprint was humming in the land itself. But here's where the hijack came in. Instead of harmonizing with these codes, colonists and later U.S. institutions suppressed them. The Great Law of Peace was partially borrowed, but stripped of its feminine authority and its emphasis on collective stewardship. The mounds were abandoned, destroyed, or ignored by settlers who couldn't recognize their sacred architecture. Indigenous ceremonies were outlawed by federal law until the late 20th century. And the people themselves were subjected to displacement, assimilation programs, and genocide. The suppression of indigenous wisdom is part of the larger feminine inversion we've been tracing. Because indigenous traditions held both polarities, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, land and sky. By erasing them, America doubled down on a fractured, masculine-dominated version of freedom and governance. So, was America hijacked or seeded with inversion? At this point, you might be wondering, so what really happened here? Was America hijacked outright by dark forces, or was it seeded with good intentions that later went wrong? The truth is more complex than a simple good versus evil split. America wasn't founded purely in coherence, but it also wasn't designed only as a control system. It was seeded with a mix of sincere vision and subtle inversion from the very beginning. On one side, you had genuine light carriers, mystics, philosophers, indigenous wisdom keepers, and even some of the founders who truly believed America could be a new spiral node, a chance to re anchor the divine blueprint. They encoded freedom, balance, and sacred geometry into its architecture and ideals. On the other side, inversion was already woven in, not necessarily because every actor was bad, but because the lineages bringing Gnosis into America were already fractured. They carried geometry and ritual, but without feminine polarity. They carried ideals of liberty, but inside empire frameworks of colonization and hierarchy. So instead of a clean hijack, what we see is a double coding from the very beginning. America was seeded as both blueprint and inversion, possibility and paradox. That's why we get a republic founded on freedom but built on slavery, a constitution inspired by the great law of peace but stripped of women's authority, a city designed on sacred geometry but governed through hierarchy. It wasn't that one side planted something pure and the dark swooped in later. It was that the blueprint and the distortion were both present from the start, carried together in the same seed. And that's actually the deeper teaching. The question of America is the question of the spiral itself. If we lose coherence and let inversion creep in, can we find our way back? Can we remember how to align with source even inside paradox? So now let's talk about the bigger context, the polarity shift in frequency. To really see why all of this matters, we have to zoom out and remember the larger backdrop we've been talking about throughout this series, the polarity shift. The divine integration program was always about polarity. Not just light versus dark, but the balance of masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, form and tone. In its original design, those polarities weren't meant to be in conflict. They were meant to spiral together, creating coherence. And that's what we mean when we talk about white hole physics, a state where frequency flows outward in expansion, harmony, and creation. But once the program collapsed into black hole physics, polarity stopped integrating and started collapsing into distortion. Instead of spiraling upward, frequency began siphoning downward. That's where amnesia, hierarchy, and inversion set in. Because when frequency drops, gnosis gets harder to access. People forget their direct connection to source and start outsourcing truth to external authorities. America, like Atlantis before it, was seeded as a chance to intervene in that spiral. The vision was, if enough freedom could be created, freedom of conscious, speech, gathering, experimenting, then maybe people could raise their frequency again. Maybe they could reawaken gnosis, integrate polarity, and stabilize the shift back into coherence. So when we look at America's paradox, blueprint and inversion in the same seed, it's not just about history or politics. It's about frequency. Every law, every symbol, every choice either raises the field towards coherence or drags it further into distortion. And because both were present from the beginning, America became, and still is, a kind of crucible for the polarity shift. The big question has always been, will the blueprint reassert itself through gnosis and integration? Or will the inversion win out through hierarchy and control? That's the same spiral question humanity has been facing since the beginning. And here's where we add another layer. When the original seeding of America faltered, the strategy itself shifted. The earlier esoteric orders, the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, mystics, and philosophers were carrying fragments of the divine blueprint. They encoded sacred geometry into architecture, hid gnosis in symbols, and drafted constitutions with the language of freedom. In their density band, this top down approach made sense. The body as temple was still veiled, direct gnosis was persecuted, and institutions seemed like the safest vessels to preserve truth. They believed that if they could shape governments, lodges, and monuments, they could shape consciousness. But that strategy was incomplete. Because institutions themselves were already seated in hierarchy and inversion, coherence could never fully stabilize. Without the feminine principle embodied, the spiral bent back toward control. The blueprint survived as memory in symbols and allegories, but it did not take root as living coherence. So when America's first seeding faltered, Source shifted the strategy. Instead of trying to build coherence through compromised systems, America was reseeded through people. Starseeds, mystics, and coherence carriers began incarnating as living spirals, each holding fragments of the divine blueprint in their DNA. This new approach bypassed broken institutions by anchoring coherence directly into the human body. The body became the architecture. The womb, the fascia, the breath became the new temples where gnosis could live again. This wasn't the first time Source seeded coherence through people. Across history, there have always been singular exemplars who carried more of the divine blueprint online by default. Figures like Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, who embodied the feminine and masculine spirals in full integration. Their lives encoded resurrection, coherence, and union as living demonstrations of what was possible, even when the collective template was dimmed. But what's different about the reseeding of America is scale. Instead of a few rare individuals, entire waves of souls began incarnating with extra strands switched on or partially embodied. These are the starseeds and coherence carriers of our age. Each holds a fragment of the divine blueprint in their DNA, and as those fragments awaken, they create a network effect. It's no longer about one or two beings carrying the spiral for everyone else. It's about the collective body remembering itself strand by strand. This is why embodiment has become the strategy now. Architecture and symbols can echo coherence, but only the body can generate it. The womb, the fascia, the breath, the nervous system, these are the true temples where gnosis anchors and light becomes flesh. And that's the architecture that cannot be hijacked in the same way institutions once were. I'll talk more about this when we arc into the Blueprint Restored episodes, because this shift from institutional strategy to embodied strategy is crucial. As I've said before, none of this is random. It's all very strategic. And yet, even with this reseeding through people, we can't fully understand America's paradox without looking back at the original vision of those who shaped it. The esoteric brotherhoods did see something. Fragments of the polarity shift, a dream of freedom, even whispers of a new Atlantis. But what they saw and what they missed would define the fault lines of America's spiral from the very beginning. So let's talk about what the Brotherhood saw and what they missed. To understand America's paradox even more clearly, we need to ask, what exactly did the esoteric Brotherhood see? Yes, they were guided. Many of these groups believed they were acting under divine inspiration or cosmic orchestration. Francis Bacon literally framed the new Atlantis as a utopian model where knowledge, science, and spirit could flourish free of corruption. Freemasonic and Rosicrucian lore often spoke of a new dawn for humanity. At some level, they knew this was more than politics. It was about seeding a higher possibility. The next thing that the Brotherhood saw, they wanted freedom to grow. The Brotherhoods understood that gnosis and spiritual development couldn't flourish under monarchies and church control. They needed a place where people had enough freedom of speech, conscious, and self governance to experiment, initiate, and raise their frequency. America was imagined as that laboratory. The next thing is they carried fragments of the polarity shift vision. They saw that humanity was in a long arc of amnesia and inversion, and that a reset point was needed. They imagined America as a node where the collective could pivot back toward alignment. So, yes, at least at the visionary level, they were trying to help humanity shift polarity. But they didn't see the whole spiral. Because of the inversion already baked into their orders, they missed three essential pieces. The first piece was the feminine. They didn't realize you can't rebuild the spiral without tone leading. They still carried patriarchal exclusion, so the project was half lit from the start. The second thing is embodiment. They glimpsed fragments of the body as temple, but mostly as metaphor. They believed sacred architecture, geometry, and ritual could entrain people into coherence. And to a degree, that was true. Standing in a cathedral or Masonic hall, the body does resonate with harmony. But without DNA awakened, without the fascia, womb, and breath recognized as the living architecture, coherence remained external. The spiral could be reflected in stone, but not stabilized in flesh. And the third thing is Indigenous codes. They overlooked, or in many cases suppressed, the fact that the spiral was already alive in the peoples of the land. They thought they were planning something new, when actually they were standing on top of a living blueprint that didn't need to be replaced, just honored. So the Brotherhoods had a vision of America as a new Atlantis, a freedom experiment, and a potential frequency shift. That was real. But because they lacked feminine integration, land based gnosis, and true embodiment, the vision bent toward empire the moment it hit material form. And here's the big picture. They were right about the goal: freedom as a condition for raising frequency, and America as a convergence node for the polarity shift. But they didn't hold enough coherence to land it fully. They had geometry without womb, ideals without integration, symbols without embodiment. And that's why we get America's paradox: both blueprint and inversion seeded in the same soil. So now let's talk about how America was inverted. If America carried both blueprint and inversion from the beginning, the next question is, how did this inversion actually play out? At its core, the vision was freedom. But almost immediately, that freedom was compromised by slavery, land theft, and economic exploitation. A republic built on liberty coexisted with the systemic bondage of African people, the genocide and displacement of indigenous nations, and the extraction of both land and bodies for profit. The paradox wasn't hidden, it was written into the foundation. And from there, the distortions multiplied. Freedom became individualism. The ideal of liberty as a path back to source bent into the cult of the self. Every man for himself, often at the expense of the collective spiral. Prosperity became consumerism. Abundance as a reflection of divine flow devolved into accumulation, materialism, and the endless appetite of extraction economies. Union became nationalism. The sacred idea of collective belonging was reduced to flags, borders, and militarized identity, weaponizing unity into division. Spiritual gnosis became organized religion. Direct connection to source was replaced with dogma, hierarchy, and external authority, reasserting the same church control the brotherhoods had hoped to escape. Innovation became exploitation. America's disruptive spirit, which could have opened new pathways of coherence, too often turned into technological dominance, industrial conquest, and the commodification of nature. Equality became hierarchy. Even the language of all men are created equal hardened into structures that privilege some while erasing others. Patriarchy, white supremacy, and empire repackaged as liberty. This is what it looks like when blueprint and inversion share the same soil. Every ideal can carry both a light and a shadow expression. The more the feminine was excluded, the more the spiral bent toward hierarchy, and the more America's promise of freedom morphed into its opposite. Now let's talk about cultural nuance, exploiting the paradox, balancing the polarity. If we zoom out to the cultural level, America's paradox shows up in how we live, work, and relate to life itself. On one side, America has become known for grind culture, overwork, obsession with money, constant striving. The shadow of the spiral shows up here as endless productivity, individualism, and achievement measured by material success. But inside that same current is a gift. America also challenges the status quo. It carries an energy of innovation, disruption, and refusal to accept how things have always been. That impulse can bend into distortion, but it can also open real breakthroughs. By contrast, Europe is often seen as the counterbalance. Work-life balance, valuing leisure, living to live rather than living to work. At its best, that cultural current embodies rhythm, enjoyment, and relational richness. But even here, there's a shadow. Sometimes the same contentment without balance becomes complacency. Go with the flow can calcify into don't rock the boat. In that way, Europe's ideal can also keep people trapped in the status quo. Neither current is wrong. They're both expressions of polarity. America's drive without balance collapses into burnout. Europe's ease without disruption collapses into stagnation. What we actually need is both. The willingness to disrupt and innovate, anchored by balance and embodied enjoyment. The polarity has to be integrated. In earlier episodes, I've said to win the game, we need to exploit the paradox. And that's true. But the deeper truth is we need to balance the polarity. Those are just two ways of saying the same thing. Whether it's nations, cultures, or individuals, coherence doesn't come from choosing one side of the paradox and rejecting the other. It comes from weaving both together, just like the spiral was always meant to do. And this is the bigger pattern. Polarity shows up everywhere, in cultures, in nations, and even in the very stones of our cities. Just as America and Europe each carry gifts and shadows, so too did the founders of America try to capture balance through symbols and geometry. They believed that if they could etch divine proportion into the land itself, it might help hold the field steady. And to a degree, that was true. Architecture does entrain energy. But as we've seen, without embodiment, symbols remain external reflections. This is why, if we follow the influence of Francis Bacon, the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons forward, it's easy to see their fingerprints in the founding of the United States, especially in Washington, D.C. So now let's talk about esoteric symbolism in Washington, D.C. and America's foundations. The city was laid out in the late 1700s by Pierre Charles L'Enfant. under the direction of George Washington, a high-ranking Freemason. Its grid isn't random. It's filled with geometric alignments and esoteric symbols. So here are some examples. The first one is the compass and square. If you overlay a map of downtown DC, you can trace the classic Masonic symbol, the compass and square, formed by the arrangement of streets around the Capitol, the White House, and the Washington Monument. These are the same symbols used in Masonry to represent divine proportion and the balance of spirit, compass, and matter, square. The second example is the obelisk. The Washington Monument is a direct copy of the Egyptian obelisk, a structure that in ancient times symbolized the ray of the sun, divine masculine energy, and connection between heaven and earth. When placed in DC, it became both a sacred symbol and, depending on intent, a power marker. The third example is the Capitol Dome. Inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, the dome symbolizes the cosmic womb, the union of heaven and earth within a circular geometric container. At its center is the apotheosis of Washington, a fresco depicting Washington ascending into divinity. It reflects the esoteric teaching that humans can embody God consciousness. But again, depending on how you view it, it can also be seen as a co-opted symbol of hierarchy and deification of political power. The fourth example is pentagram streets. Parts of the DC street grid form a pentagram pointing toward the White House. The pentagram in sacred geometry represents the microcosm, the human being in harmony with divine proportion. Think Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. But when inverted or stripped of spirit, it can also be read as a symbol of control or occult power. And it wasn't just the city. National symbols were chosen with similar dual coding. The Great Seal of the United States, with the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye, comes straight out of Masonic and Rosicrucian imagery. In one reading, the pyramid represents strength and endurance, while the eye symbolizes divine providence guiding the nation. In another, it's seen as a symbol of surveillance and elite control. The eagle on the seal carries the same dual resonance we talked about earlier, a sacred bird of vision in Indigenous tradition, but also a Roman imperial standard. Even the number of stars and stripes on the flag were aligned with geometric harmonics. 13 stars and 13 stripes echo the 13 original colonies, but also tie into esoteric numerology. 12 around 1, the pattern of archetypes and integration. So the blueprint was encoded into the very architecture, symbols, and rituals of the nation. But here's the critical point. Symbols themselves aren't good or evil. They're carriers of frequency. When aligned with source, they amplify coherence. When used by empire, they reinforce hierarchy and control. That's why America holds so much paradox. The same seal, the same monument, the same grid can either be read as a genuine attempt to anchor the new Atlantis or as evidence of inversion. The truth is, it's both. The divine blueprint was carried forward, but it was hijacked almost immediately. And here's where we can connect this back to what we talked about earlier with the brotherhoods and the feminine inversion. Take the Capitol Dome, for example. Architecturally, it's a symbol of the cosmic womb, a container of creation, union between heaven and earth. In its pure form, that's a sacred acknowledgement of the feminine as the generative field. But look at how it functions in practice. Beneath that dome, only men held office for more than a century. The womb symbol was there in stone, but the actual feminine voice was excluded from governance. This is the same pattern we've been tracing. The geometry and the symbols carried fragments of the divine blueprint, but the way they were implemented already reflected inversion. The feminine was honored in image, but denied in embodiment. Liberty was carved as a statue, Columbia painted as an allegory, Lady Justice placed outside the courthouse. But real women were absent from power, voice, and initiation. So even in America's founding symbols, you can see the split between blueprint and hijack. The symbols themselves are neutral. They can amplify coherence or hierarchy. But when one polarity is missing, when tone is stripped from form, the field bends toward control. That's why America carries such paradox. It wasn't all light or all dark. It was both from the beginning. The sacred spiral encoded in architecture, and the inversion already seated in its application. So now let's talk about the core message, restoring the feminine and gnosis. When we trace this whole arc from the divine integration program to Atlantis to America as the new Atlantis, one theme comes through again and again. The spiral only holds when the feminine leads. Not women versus men, but feminine energy as tone, the vibrational field, intuition, gnosis, receptivity to source. Masculine energy is not diminished here. It has its sacred role. But it follows as form, structure, and action. What went wrong in Atlantis, in the esoteric brotherhoods, in America's founding, is that the feminine was excluded, silenced, or reduced to symbol. The womb became shame, gnosis became heresy, liberty became a statue instead of a lived reality. And without the feminine leading, the spiral collapses. Geometry becomes hierarchy. Symbols become control. Freedom becomes empire. That's why the way forward isn't just political reform or new institutions. It's the restoration of gnosis, direct, embodied knowing of source. Gnosis itself is a feminine current. It's not belief handed down from a priest or a textbook. It's lived resonance in the body, in the land, in our cells. So yeah, the core message is that we must return to gnosis, and we must restore the feminine to her rightful place as tone setter. Only then can the masculine follow in coherence. That's how the blueprint reactivates. That's how the spiral comes back into balance. Now let's talk about why America still matters. So here's the thing. For all of its paradox, all its distortion, all its inversion, America still matters. Why? Because the node never disappeared. The original seeding may have bent under the weight of hierarchy and suppression, but the frequency grid is still alive. America continues to function as a planetary crucible, a convergent zone where polarity plays out in the open. Every generation, every wave of souls, the spiral gets another chance to reset. That's why Source reseeded America through people, starseeds, mystics, coherence carriers. Entire waves of us came here not by accident, but because America remains a central testing ground for the polarity shift. The same paradox that once threatened coherence now creates the conditions for breakthrough. When freedom gets distorted into individualism, it forces us to ask what true freedom really is. When consumerism hollows out prosperity, it pushes us to remember abundance as flow instead of accumulation. When nationalism warps union, it confronts us with the need for belonging that transcends borders. And this is what I mean when I say America is strategic. Its density makes it messy. Its paradox makes it hard. But those same qualities also make it potent. The inversion is loud here, but so is the blueprint. Both are visible, both are embodied, Both are fighting for expression. That's why what happens here doesn't just stay here. The ripple effects move across the planet. So, no, America isn't just another empire doomed to collapse. It is still a spiral node. It is still a convergence point where the divine blueprint can reassert itself. The question is the same one it's always been. Will we embody coherence? Will we restore gnosis? Will we let the feminine lead? Because if we do, then America can fulfill its true role, not as empire, but as the new Atlantis it was meant to be. A land where freedom is gnosis, prosperity is flow, and union is resonance with source. Now let's talk about restoring the blueprint. So where does that leave us? If America still matters, if its node is still alive, then the task isn't to abandon it as a failed experiment. The task is to restore the blueprint it was meant to carry. And that restoration doesn't begin in government buildings or new constitutions. It begins in us. The esoteric brotherhoods try to encode coherence in stone and symbol, and to some extent they succeeded. The geometry is still there, humming under the grid. But we know now the deeper truth. Coherence only stabilizes when it's embodied. The real temples are not monuments or domes. They are fascia, womb, breath, blood. They are living bodies remembering their connection to source. Restoring the blueprint means remembering that freedom isn't just political, it's spiritual. It's the freedom to know God directly, without hierarchy. It's the freedom to live in resonance, not extraction. It's the freedom of a nervous system that can rest, expand, and create in coherence. It means reclaiming prosperity as flow, not accumulation. Union is resonance, not nationalism. Equality is integration of polarity, not flattening into hierarchy. And just as importantly, it means restoring the feminine, not as symbol, but as tone, not as allegory, but as embodiment. Without the feminine leading, the spiral collapses. But with her restored, the spiral regenerates. That is how America's node can still fulfill its role, by becoming a land where the feminine current is finally honored in form, where gnosis is lived again, where the body and the land are recognized as sacred architecture. This is why the blueprint matters now more than ever, because the paradox that has defined America is the same paradox we each carry in our own spiral: blueprint and inversion, possibility and distortion, woven together. To restore America's blueprint is to restore our own. And when we do, the field itself shifts, not just for one nation, but for the entire planet. So here's where we land. America was never just a nation. It was and still is a spiral node seated with both blueprint and inversion. The question has never been whether the distortion was real. It was. The question has always been whether the blueprint can still break through. And this brings us to the next chapter in our journey, the false spiral. Because before we can restore the blueprint, we have to see clearly how the spiral itself has been hijacked, not just in America, but across culture, spirituality, and even our own inner lives. The false spiral is what happens when the form of the spiral is imitated, but the tone is missing. It looks like growth, but it loops. It looks like freedom, but it traps. If America shows us the paradox of blueprint and inversion in a nation, the false spiral shows us the same paradox playing out in the psyche, the ways inversion disguises itself as progress. And unless we can discern between the true spiral and its counterfeit, we'll keep repeating history instead of remembering who we are. So in the next episode, we're going to dive into what the false spiral looks like, how it hooks us, and why recognizing it is the key step before the blueprint can be restored. because as we've seen, the spiral always carries both possibility and distortion. The task is learning how to tell them apart. That's all I have for this episode. If you want bonus content, go subscribe to my Patreon. I would absolutely love to see you there. I love you all, and I'll see you next week.